Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Steindl, and welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt. Today's episode takes us into the world of boarding schools. Not the glossy brochure version, but the real complex experiences of those who've lived them. My guest is clinical psychologist Dr. Lolly Hernandez, whose remarkable research explored how attending boarding school impacts compassion, self-criticism, and attachment later in life. This topic is often cloaked in silence. Boarding can be framed as a privilege, yet for many it comes with intense loneliness, rigid discipline, and even trauma. Lolly's thesis draws on the voices of over 600 adults, ex-boarders and ex-day students alike, and reveals powerful patterns in how early school environments shape our inner lives, our relationships, and our capacity to give and receive compassion. In this conversation, we'll talk about the psychological legacy of boarding school, the shame that can come with seeking support after privileged experiences, and what all this means for therapy, parenting, and even leadership in society. It's an important, sensitive, and at times challenging discussion, but it's also filled with insight and hope. And so I bring you Lolly Hernandez. Great. Well, Lolly Hernandez, welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt.
Thank you. Nice to see you and meet you.
Wonderful to have you on the show, so to speak, which sounds like a funny way to put it. But you've done your recent study investigating boarding school experiences, compassion, self-criticism, attachment in adults. So I think it's sort of a bit of a retrospective, looking back on those experiences. What drew you to explore boarding school experiences as the focus of your postgrad thesis?
Um, I guess there was a few kind of components to it. I went to boarding school myself, so I had personal experience to draw upon, and it was never really something that I thought had that big of an impact on me. Only until I started training in or working towards, I guess, training in psychology that I started thinking about and noticing that this was quite, in some ways, an unusual experience to have had, and maybe did influence me in ways I hadn't realized. So I had that kind of personal interest and kind of drive to think more about it. And then when I was choosing my thesis topic, I started reading more about the literature around kind of boarding schools and a lot of the work of Nick Duffel and Joy Chavrin, which talks about this concept called boarding school syndrome, which talks about, it was really based on their psychoanalysts and therapists. So it was really based on their clinical observations of working with boarders or ex-boarders as adults. And I just noticed, I guess, that there wasn't much research in terms of quantitative clinical based research out there. It was more like case study and based on the kind of practice. So I was kind of seeing like two worlds collided quite well. There was this experience and lots of writing about it, but also a gap in terms of not a lot of researchy research. And then the kind of compassion element as well that I got introduced to. I thought, oh, this just seems to fit really well, potentially could fit really well together. So that's how it came about, I suppose.
Mm. And what was some of the early boarding school syndrome kind of components there? Like what were some of the things that these psychotherapists or clinicians had been noticing?
So I might have to refer to some notes here.
It's
So
okay.
the idea is that they notice ex-boarders struggling in lots of different ways, but a lot in terms of their interpersonal relationships, in terms of compassion, and in terms of kind of competitiveness and self-criticism. So Joy Chavrin came up with this terminology of boarding school syndrome, and it has four components to it, which she breaks down as A, B, C, D. So A is about abandonment. So this idea that parents are leaving children in schools. So it's experienced as a form of abandonment, and there's these long periods of separation. The B part is about bereavement. So she talks a lot about how that is experienced as a loss. So the person or child, or the child going to boarding school, loses everything that's familiar to them. So their environment, their friends, their loved ones, their pets, the food that they're used to eating, which is really interesting, I think, when we think a lot about the kind of international borders that we see a lot more nowadays as well. So there's kind of bereavement that's involved in the process of going to boarding school, but also how that comes out through the form of homesickness. So she talks about how this process of bereaving and of losing and bereavement repeats again and again. It's almost like every term, you know, you go home, you go back, you go home, you go back. So this constant cycle of bereavement and loss. The C part is linked to captivity. So, and again, I guess I want to like say this is from one lens of boarding school. So she talks about captivity. So the child is almost held captive at the school. She likens it to like a prison. Like you can't leave. The adults, the kind of powerful adults, are in charge, and they say when you can leave and when you can't leave. And often these schools being, I guess, kind of set back and not necessarily like well connected in like the middle of cities always, like often in a little bubble. And then she talks about as well the element of having to wear a uniform and or look a certain way with kind of quite strict rules and expectations, part of that kind of captive bit. And then the D element is, I suppose, where we see a lot of the clinical implications coming out in terms of dissociation. So she talks about how children learn how to cope with the abandonment and the loss and the kind of sense of being out of control and held captive by dissociating. So no one comes to help them when they cry. They learn to kind of cut off and not feel those feelings and not attend to them anymore as a survival strategy. But that actually causes problems down the line, which I've kind of talked about a little bit in my research in terms of the implications for society of that. You've got a cohort of people who've learned to do this. And Nick Duffel sort of added a bit to it in terms of I think he calls it the strategic survival personality. So this idea of adopting this personality to help you survive these situations when you are so young. And I think their thinking and their theories were based on maybe older boarding practices. I think things have really improved since then, which was another part of my kind of interest in the research in terms of, is this something that's still happening now and is still around? So yeah, I was just really interested in this idea.
Yes, there's the A, B, C, D. They're kind of profound concepts, aren't they? That are well worth thinking about. That there is. They're very strong words too, aren't they? You know, the notion of abandonment, bereavement, captivity, dissociation. But you can sort of imagine, especially depending on the age of the person and the other experiences they've had, and then the experiences they have upon reaching boarding school, you can sort of, you know, it's sort of, you know, to imagine the child who's there trying to cope with all of that and work it all out and make sense of this dramatic change. Presumably there are some common drivers too in terms of kids being in boarding school or parental kind of decisions that have to be made and certain imperatives that perhaps are behind it. But there are these kind of implications, I guess, for the little people, you know, to kind of deal with all of that.
Absolutely. And I think that from kind of their work and the sort of things I've seen or heard, it's often done with really good intentions, you know, thought like this is an amazing opportunity, or well, it's a whole family tradition, at least in the UK, you know, it's a family culture and tradition and it's an honor. And yeah, again, I think it is that. This is why I think CFT fits so well with it, because it is that unintended consequence of like, yes, you know, it's got all these brilliant parts to it and really amazing opportunities, but actually there's these downsides that maybe aren't considered or given enough weight or thought about. So yeah, I think it's tricky, and I think their work maps really well onto, because her book's called Boarding School Syndrome: The Trauma of the Privileged Child, and it's like
Mm.
privileged like this. So I think for me, it was kind of the first way into thinking about actually these two things exist. Yes, there's like a lot of privilege linked to going to boarding school, but actually a lot of, yeah, cost and unintended consequences, and they're not mutually exclusive, I suppose.
Mm. One of the little statistics that sort of struck me when I was reading some of your work was you highlight that around 70,000 children board in the UK, and that's
Mm.
a similar number to those who are in care as well, in a sense. And can you say more about that, or what that maybe tells us about the scale, or perhaps even the potential impact?
Yeah, so that was in 2020, and then I had a look for 2024, and it's gone down a little bit. It's like 65 or 66,000 boarders in the UK. Um, I guess for me, it feels like that is quite a significant number, and the contrast that was sort of in my mind was the amount of support and things that are around, I guess, looked after the children or children in care, which is totally needed. It's really important, but almost the lack of understanding or research or thinking about actually those experiences of borders. So I think it felt like a bit of a gap. Like there's some similarities between those experiences, obviously a lot of differences as well. But I think for me, I was thinking, well, this is actually affecting quite a like significant proportion of the population. It's kind of going under the radar. Like I don't think it's that well known or considered or thought about.
It is just to sort of to reflect. Yes, it is this privilege piece in a way, isn't it? That the privilege, in a way, kind of masks or hides or makes it feel less urgent, maybe, to really address those things, and yet the experience of a child going into a boarding school has similarities and differences, but similarities to
Mm.
going into care.
Yeah, and I think that's I'm sure it was Joy Shavrin who said about that made that kind of link or comparison in a way, or likened it. But she was talking about how there's an element to it in terms of boarding where you have to wrap your head around the fact that your parents are choosing to send you away and paying people to care for you instead of themselves. Whereas in and again, this is broad brush strokes, and it is a bit of a generalization, but you could hypothesize children going into care. Maybe there is that element of it was taken out of our control. Like our parents maybe didn't want us to go, but the state got involved and said, this is happening, or making this
Mm,
decision. So she talks about in her book, like having to wrap your head around the fact that, yeah, parents are actively choosing that or making that decision, and that how does that influence the person in that situation.
mm.
It's a bit of a minefield.
It is, and I really appreciate that you're thinking about it in delicate terms. Like we're not trying to
Mm,
compare some of the different experiences of people, or the perhaps even the trauma of people, but it is also important to sort of, yeah, just to note the. I really liked how you said the unintended consequences. That is a very CFT sort of a way to think about it, and even when there are, you know, good intentions or even necessary intentions, there can be
mm,
various unintended consequences. I remember at my school, a lot of the boarders were coming from rural families who had, properties
mm,
out west, and to go to school meant to go, further afield, and so there was a sort of a necessity there, and at the same time you could see that sometimes the boarders struggled with the adjustment, and it was tough, and especially uh, well, not to preempt what you found, but especially as things started to happen. So, you looked at compassion. you looked at
Yeah.
self-criticism and attachment. So yeah, what led you to consider those as the important variables to consider with this population?
I mean, there were so many variables. I had to, I had great support from Philip Molyneux and Tim Alexander to try and kind of wield this massive thing into something that was still pretty massive by the end of it. But I guess those things stuck out for me in terms of the literature. So the things that were being picked up or written about and observed in clinical populations of ex-boarders. And just thinking about how can we bring together the kind of existing measures and psychological theory of those bits and kind of complement the stuff that was around the boarding school syndrome. Can we find the kind of research, like quantitative research, or I can't think of the right word, but empirical data, I guess, to kind of back up or investigate
Yeah.
these topics. So yeah, there was kind of suggestions that boarders might struggle with compassion, and like learn to close themselves off from it. So I was really interested in like the three flows of compassion and thinking, well, is that actually happening? Is it that boarders kind of shut off that compassion? Thinking about the political element to it, because at the time of the study, there was it was based in the UK government. There was a lot of ex-boarders and privately educated people in the cabinet. So I was thinking about that compassion to others. How does that influence kind of policy and decisions that were being made at the time? So the kind of those flows of compassion, and actually, how does someone have self-compassion if they're growing up in an environment that maybe doesn't encourage that? The attachment side, I guess I was interested in thinking about, well, because they were writing, Nick Duffel and Joy Shavrin writing about how boarding school is like a disruption to the attachment. So I was thinking, is there, how does attachment come out? What do we notice in terms of actively recording and measuring that? And then the self-criticism side, I was just thinking about the environment being quite striving and high pressure and competitive, from my own experience as well, I suppose, and thinking, does that actually translate into difficulties with self-criticism down the line? So that's how I came about those three things. But there was absolutely loads more that I would have wanted to look at.
And just to remind me, you looked at the flows of compassion and not the fears of compassion.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. Looked at the flow, so yeah.
Yeah. Yes, no, it's no, that's very cool. You can sort of imagine that, well, with words like abandonment, bereavement, and so on, that attachment is, potentially taking a bit of a hit in terms of, safe haven, secure base type ideas. From there, it might be harder to feel safe, to be compassionate towards others, or to receive compassion, or offer it to oneself. And in fact, one might double down from that more threat-based drive kind of perspective and just start to learn more self-criticism along the way. So those variables make a lot of sense. And yes, you do have to try to funnel them down, don't you? Otherwise, these theses become bigger than Ben-Hur. So what were some of the key differences really that you found, maybe between the ex-boarders and the ex-day students, I guess?
Yeah, so we actually, there were so many participants. There was over 600 in the end, but it was like a split of boarders and days. But so we had subcategories of boarders. So we had full boarders who boarded throughout term time and maybe went home on the holidays. Then weekly boarders who went home on the weekends, but that was a much smaller group. So for the main analysis, we looked at ex full boarders and ex-day students. And we found that ex-full boarders had significantly lower levels of compassion to others. So they struggled to be compassionate to others, but also struggled to receive compassion from others compared to ex-day students. Interestingly, there was no difference between the two groups in terms of self-compassion, which was surprising. And we found that significantly more ex-boarders, or ex-full boarders, had insecure, fearful attachment styles, whereas more ex-day students had secure attachments. So yeah, I think that was really interesting. And then in terms of self-criticism, again, there was no difference between the two groups in those statistic analysis.
So it like, how would you interpret that the flows toward of compassion towards others and receiving from others, and the insecure or fearful attachment style? How are you thinking about those kind of two findings in combination?
Well, I guess with the insecure, fearful attachment style, from that particular understanding of attachment, because I guess there's loads of different ways of thinking about it, but that particular way is about maybe wanting closeness, but fearing that from happening. So, or potentially losing it. So I think that would make sense in terms of maybe not even letting the compassion in, or even noticing it from other people if it's around. And then in terms of compassion for others, I guess I'm not sure if there's something about the modeling of it. So if you're in an environment that maybe you're not noticing that compassion, or it actually isn't even there, how do you then share that or do that to somebody else? So that's sort of how I've come to understand it. But again, it's just one snapshot in time, I suppose. I think that's something to bear in mind. It's this particular cohort of people. It might not generalize out, and I guess it can go the other way. I know lots of boarders, and include myself, who is super compassionate towards other people. So it was interesting in how that came about.
Yeah, but it does have a kind of a making sense to it, doesn't it? That if someone is fearful, insecure and fearful with their attachment style, that's to do with attachment with others. And so giving and receiving compassion kind of does involve the other. And therefore, if someone is feeling concerned or unsafe or mistrustful or something like that, then those two flows involving another person, up come the fears, I guess, of the fears of compassion. That, what if that other person takes advantage of me or my compassion, or what if they look like they're giving me compassion but they don't really care, or so the
Yeah.
interpersonal nature of it is perhaps really key there in the attachment style. Self-compassion is kind of a little bit of a combo of giving and receiving, I guess, in a way. It's just that you are both the giver and the receiver of it. And so it is curious, really, that didn't show any particular differences there. Yes, it's really interesting to think about. Your findings suggest that perceived closeness of peers, supportiveness of staff, were also linked to greater compassion and more secure attachment, which is kind of like a really important finding too, isn't it? I mean, it matters really what is, the boarding school itself, and how things are run, and the staffing and the environment, and the relational environment amongst the boarders. So yeah, what can you tell us about there in terms of, perhaps what can really make a boarding experience more positive?
So that finding was based on the data for all of the participants, so day students and boarders. It was a big regression analysis that we did. I think for me, it's interesting in terms of general education and school practices, how these things are important, not just for boarders, but generally. I think because what we found as well was we had these different school environment variables, so like closeness of peers, supportiveness of staff, threat of the school environment. So when we took those things out of the analysis, we found that they were well, super correlated with this thing that we created called the boarding exposure score. And this was a kind of rough way of trying to capture like depth and breadth of boarding experience. So it took into account how old the person was when they started boarding, how long they boarded for, and if what type of boarder they were. So did they go home at the weekends? Did they have longer periods of time away from home? So when we took out those environment variables, we found that the boarding exposure score, so how long and what type of boarding someone went to, it was related to or started to predict more fearful attachments and higher rated scores of hated self and self-criticism and lower reassured self in self-criticism. So for me, it made me think about, yeah, it's really important that the environmental factors, so like having a close year group, having staff that are supportive, being in an environment that doesn't feel punitive or punishing or scary, but also is there something about boarding experience in terms of how old you are when you start boarding? Because in the UK, people can start super young, like year three. I don't know how that translates, but really young. So how old you are when you start boarding, how long you board for, and yeah, how often are you going home and sort of going out of that bubble, or are you immersed in that for the whole time? So I think those factors also are important to consider in terms of what's making and breaking the experience.
Mm. So, age of entering boarding school, type of boarding, sort of pattern of boarding, longer term versus just weekdays, and certain environmental or contextual factors, even that can predict harsher self-criticism or self-hating self.
Mm.
And it's sort of really it sort of motivates the sense of, well, what can we do? Well, if someone is starting earlier, we really need to create a boarding school context where they can feel close to their peers, supported by staff. There's a kind of a really important efforts to be made in terms of creating an experience that can maybe somewhat make up for or compensate for. I'm not sure what the right word is. Just that boarding exposure variable.
Mm. Mm.
You also found the sort of the opposite side, I guess, that more competitive or threatening school environments predicted higher self-criticism and more insecure attachment styles. So what was some of the findings there in terms of competition and threatening, in terms of shaping a young person's internal world?
Mm. I guess the way I've sort of understood it is that through that CFT threat formulation. So thinking about how those experiences of growing up, because I guess that's what children are doing in boarding schools. They're growing up. They're not just going to school. They're being parented there. So how they're developing, I would see that as part of those key or historical influences in that kind of first column of the formulation. So thinking about growing up in an environment that might be sort of threatening or unsafe or competitive, then influencing the kind of threats or fears a person might have about themselves or about others. So maybe expecting others to be really harsh or critical, or believing or learning to believe, I guess, that they're only valuable or worthy if they're the best, or they're achieving loads, or that others are unsafe and can't be trusted. So for me, I think those aspects of the experience can form those, historical influences that then shape how a person goes on to experience themselves and also expect other people to relate to them, and forms those kind of blueprints for relationships, I suppose, in terms of how they relate to others and expect to be related to in return.
Yeah, the sort of the memories of warmth and safeness versus the fear or shame based difficult / traumatic experiences, I guess. The sort
Mm.
of the role of shame memories or the sort
Mm.
of self-conscious emotions that arise in a kind of seemingly highly competitive environment or with an environment with a lot of social threat or how am I being held in the minds of others and perhaps even sometimes being told how people are thinking or feeling about you and all of that creates more your threat mind, your threat system activation and perhaps even somewhat compromises the soothing system a little bit and trying to kind of grow up and then developing certain core or key relational fears that go on to stick with the person into adulthood, something like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, because I guess for me as well, it's not just the explicit competitiveness that might come to mind when you think about boarding schools or that kind of privately educated stereotype of, like you've got
Rugby,
to beat
for
the,
example.
yeah, rugby or hockey or, yeah, there's that element to it. But I guess for me, there's something about when you strip it back, you go home at the end of the day and you're in a boarding house filled with 30, maybe more other children and 1 to 3 caregivers, house parents, you're already competing for attention, love, care. There's so much competition that's almost implicitly within the system that you might not even be aware of. And we know that those relationships and that kind of nurture is so important for that soothing system development. And it almost feels like, yeah, we need to boost that up to compensate for the kind of inherently big threat and drive systems that are around in the boarding school system,
Yes.
just by the way it functions and has to function.
Mm. And you know what? We were talking before about this topic that I'm about to mention, and I know it is outside the scope of your study and so on, but I suppose one thing that stands out to me is that young people who are not boarders these days are exposed a lot more to that now through social media, I guess, because it was true in the olden days. When I was growing up, that you'd go home at the end of the day of school, and then you could just forget about it. Really, once you were home, and you might still be thinking there, but you didn't have any contact with anybody, and sometimes you had to go back into the fray the next day. But these days, that 50 students thing that you were mentioning before, that's kind of now happening online, even for day students. I'm not sure. I know it's not really the focus of your study, but yeah, do you have any thoughts about how things are changing like that? Implications there?
I think it's just this, for me, I think it feels like this overwhelming sense of the kind of control, loss of control, I suppose, because you've got all these people around you virtually or physically in the environment, if you're boarding, I suppose. Um, and I guess you have a little say over who's included in that circle or who's sort of forcing their way into it, especially on social media. And I guess
Mm.
the social media side of it, I wonder if there's this element as well of if I'm not involved, then what's happening without me there? So maybe kids are stuck in a position of like be involved in order to stay in the loop, but also maybe wanting to take that step back but feeling like they can't. And yeah, I think it's really insidious. It's kind of always there. It must take a lot of willpower to kind of put the phone down. I imagine it'd be very easy to just keep scrolling and not wanting to kind of miss anything or yeah, it's really concerning. You have got that kind of constant surrounding of voices and people and opinions, and
Mm.
you have to make an active effort now, I guess, to close that off or shut that down. Whereas maybe before there was more time to be on your own or take that step back or just switch off from all of that.
Yeah, it's interesting that the boarding school research might become a bit of a sort of an analogy for what young people are going through now because they are so much more intertwined with their peers. And so the quality of those peer relationships, the closeness of those peer relationships, the warm and friendly and safe experiences with them versus the competitive threat system activating, some of that might now be kind of washing into the online life that young people are leading these days.
Mm.
You also had you had your empirical kind of quantitative kind of stuff. You also had some qualitative information as well, personal reflections from participants, and yeah, I think there were kind of comments around some of the negative experiences, bullying or neglect or other other things along those lines. What was it like for you to read some of that and to really hear those very heartfelt stories that people shared about their boarding experiences?
I found it really hard going. It was really, really moving. So we had like a free text response, which we tried to keep it as open as possible in terms of what experiences do you feel shaped you most as an adult? Like, I think it was worded like that, and yeah, the kind of I mean, there was such a range of responses. Some people wrote, like paragraphs and paragraphs of text, really harrowing stories and accounts of abuse and neglect and bullying. Um, and other people have kind of short, sharp kind of responses. So I found it really upsetting, kind of reading those and thinking about it and trying to kind of group these themes together that were really distressing and like accounts of trauma, really. So I found that really, yeah, upsetting. And that's been a big motivator for me coming to speak to you and share my research is honoring the voices of those people that shared their stories, and wanting to give it the platform that it deserves and raise that awareness, because
Mm.
I think there are lots of common misconceptions at times about boarding and the media. It's a big sleepover with your friends and it's all fun and loads of adventures, and that is part of that is true. That's fair enough. But there are other sides to it that I think are important to acknowledge and for us to hold in mind, not just sort of gloss over that. So it was really upsetting, but also motivating for me to do something and give that the platform that it needs.
You mentioned right at the start that somewhat your experience was that you went through the boarding experience and I guess it's just a child's life, isn't it? That's just what they know and they do the best that they can to make sense of it. And as you said before, strategic survival, I think was a kind of a term that was coined about that. And it wasn't until somewhere into adulthood that it sort of hit you in a way, the recognition of, boy, that was tough and
Mm.
has left its mark. And it sounds a little bit like that is kind of the experience of some of these participants in your study, was that now as adults and looking back, they really can see much more clearly what it was that they went through and some of the ways that influenced their lives. That they did speak of positive experiences too. People mentioned
Mm.
friendships and all the extracurricular activities and even kind of the consequences around connection and lifelong connections, but also resilience coming out of those
Mm.
experiences. So, yeah, what did anything surprise you there in terms of some of the more positive experiences that people reported?
Um, yeah, I guess it was really nice to see those things coming through, and that was totally my experience as well in terms of like building those relationships on such a deep level that tend to last throughout time. You're kind of growing up with these people and you're kind of all in it together. So it was nice to see that coming about. And um, one of the things that I thought was also really lovely and is quite heartening to me, especially given like the current climate that we're living in, where it feels like things are so divisive, was how much people valued being exposed to different cultures and people from different countries or ways of life. And some people in the comments talked about how that's actually shaped them in terms of their career choices and maybe instilled in them like a value of not judging other people and kind of being really open and curious about different ways of life. And I thought that was really a really lovely thing that came out of it. And one of the other interesting things as well was about the sense of community and supportive members of staff that made a real difference to some ex-boarders in their experiences, and were forming those key kind of attachment figures in a really positive way, which was really nice to read as well. And how boarding for some people was a saving grace. Being at home was really unsafe or was traumatic. So actually going to boarding was a really positive thing for them, where they made almost the flip. They got everything that they maybe needed at home from that environment. So that was interesting as well. And a couple of comments talked about the development of like faith and religion, which I found interesting as well, as a positive experience that had come out of their school time, their boarding time.
One of the things I'm really sensing from you is just an awareness that both things are true at the same time. That the boarding experience can be very, very difficult and can lead to sort of difficulties with the flows of compassion and feeling safe and secure in attachment relationships, and maybe even that self-critical sort of voice, kind of that we might develop. And at the same time, people establish really important friendships, or they get to meet people from all over the world, or, they build a kind of perhaps a resilience and a lifelong direction, career-wise, or whatever it might be, out of those experiences as well. It's both of those things are really true. And I suppose your study really reminds us. I liked how you said it before. Just the idea that yes, it is a privileged group in a way, and often, it comes from a more privileged part of society, perhaps, but we're just not wanting to gloss over some of those really quite difficult aspects of boarding. What do you think clinically, like if therapists and maybe CFT therapists too, or others are working with people who've attended boarding school, and you've definitely mentioned stuff around the CFT formulation and the early experiences and how that can shape us and so on. But what might therapists keep in mind, do you think, when working with these people?
I think for me, the key thing is, just holding that, what you've said, like kind of both things can be true. There might be elements of this experience that are extremely privileged, but that comes with those unintended consequences often. So I think for me, it's like holding that idea kind of lightly and approaching it from a really compassionate point of view, like maybe having to work hard for some people to drop the judgment that might come with kind of more privileged suffering, or that idea that you've got privilege, so therefore you don't have problems. I think it's important to bear that in mind, like it's not always what it seems on the surface. And I think clinically as well, I think ex-boarders might find it quite difficult at times to acknowledge that experience was quite hard or did have negative impacts. So I do think this may be something about the way that it's introduced and not just sort of glossed over as like a fact, oh yeah, I went to boarding school and blah, 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 but kind of giving the space to explore that and unpick what was that experience actually like for you? What was it like to live with these strangers and to grow up and to be really far away from home, or whatever that involves? So I think there's something about even holding it as something important and worth exploring feels important. And holding in mind that each person's experience will be really unique, and there might be really positive things about it, but also things that were more difficult. And I think some of the writing from the more like psychotherapy based practices was talking about that boarders may struggle interpersonally. So you might find that you have to really, really hold on to that compassion flowing to others. It might be that the person you're working with, the ex-boarder, struggles to let that in. You might have to keep going and be consistent, kind of dripping that in, working with this population, if there's lots of barriers and maybe rejections of that, or struggling to let that in and accept it, I think there's something about being really consistent with that approach, and kind of habituating someone, exposing someone to the safety of compassion.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was just thinking. I mean, it's important to, in a more in a therapy way, to factor these experiences into a formulation and understand the role that they play, and there may even be particular interventions and that sort of thing. But even just keeping in mind as a therapist our own compassion, and being able to, as you were talking, I could hear, sensitivity, sympathy, distress tolerance, empathy, non-judgment, you kind of mentioned, and a kind of a care for well-being, that we're wanting to sort of bring all of those aspects of the compassionate mind to that person, and maybe that part of their experience, because their temptation is themselves to gloss over it, to feel a kind of a humility about it, that they don't want to sort of make out that it was, that they were lucky really to be there, or something like that. So and then secondly, the effect of it all might be that receiving compassion is just that little bit harder, and so drip feeding the compassion a bit, and doing the exposure and habituation with receiving compassion for the person is an important part of it. What would you say to someone, not so much the therapist, but the person perhaps who had a painful boarding experience and is just beginning to reflect on it?
I think there's something for me about just and it sounds so cliche, but I guess just being kind to yourself with this, because I guess for my experience, it was something I just took as a given. It was just something that happened, and it was a footnote in my life. So to actually start exploring it and thinking about it, and allowing myself to acknowledge things that were difficult, or were scary, or whatever happened, it kind of felt like my world was sort of breaking apart. Everything I knew and just taken for granted as a given, I was suddenly looking at it from a different perspective that was quite wobbly. Like, it felt quite destabilizing to think about it that way, especially given it's in your formative years often as well. So I think for me, there's something about starting to look at this stuff requires that courage, but also that compassion, in terms of it's a journey. It takes a long time to understand it. And I would really advocate, if you can, to get someone compassionate alongside to help you do that, because it can be a lot to think about all on your own. So there's something for me about just being kind to yourself, and patience. You've got to do a lot of work to wrap your head around it all. So I think that would be my message. Just, be kind to yourself, take it at your pace, and if you can, have a compassionate other to help you navigate those things and make sense of them, and come up with a narrative of what happened, then that's really important.
Lovely, beautifully said. So, well, what's next for you? You're in your clinical practice, or maybe some research work. What are the plans from here, Lolly?
I guess clinically, I'm working as a psychologist, and I'm bringing CFT out to my clients, which is so rewarding. I absolutely love it. Research wise, yeah, it would be good to get this research published.
I was wondering whether you might admit that. Yes. No, that sounds great. I think it would be a great contribution, and really does honour this group of people that sometimes are left with a lot of suffering.
Mm. Yeah.
Well, Lolly Hernandez, thank you for your research and all of the findings there, and very interesting and I think useful findings, and also thank you for speaking with me on compassion in a t-shirt.
Oh, thank you so much for having me and for the opportunity.